Have you ever wondered what our planet was like before the mighty gods descended from the heavens? Most of us are familiar with the theories of the Anunnaki, those mysterious creators of humanity from ancient legends. But what if I told you that even for them, there was a time that came before? Today, we are going to uncover an incredible secret hidden in the heart of ancient Sumerian texts. This is a story of primordial chaos, cosmic battles, and a great rebellion that you won't find in any standard textbook. We often assume that the gods always lived in luxury, ruling the world without a care, but that is a massive misconception. The truth is, the first gods had to work so hard that they eventually staged a revolt. Intriguing, isn't it? So, settle in and get comfortable. We're about to take a journey deep into the dawn of time. But before we begin, let me know in the comments. Do you believe ancient myths describe real historical events? Or are they just stories passed down by our ancestors? Let's see if your mind changes by the end of this video. To truly understand the scale of these events, we have to travel back thousands of years to ancient Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. It was here, in the cradle of civilization, that the mysterious Sumerian people thrived. They didn't just leave behind ruined cities, they left behind massive libraries. Their books weren't made of paper, though. They were clay tablets etched with strange wedge-shaped symbols known as cuneiform. It took scholars hundreds of years to decode this script, and when they finally did, the world was shaken. These texts didn't just talk about trade or daily life. They revealed a complex cosmology and the very history of creation. Our journey today focuses on two primary sources. The first is the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation myth with roots reaching deep into Sumerian antiquity. The second is the epic of Atrahasis. Hidden within these ancient lines are the names, the motives, and the actions of the beings who shaped our reality, long before the first human ever set foot upon the earth. Let's go back to the very beginning. What did the universe look like before our world, before humanity, and even before the Anunnaki themselves? Imagine a vast, silent abyss, utterly empty and endless. According to ancient Sumerian texts, this was the state of existence at the dawn of time. There were no planets to light the cosmos, no stars to guide the way, and no solid ground beneath our feet. There was only an infinite, churning, dark, primordial ocean. But this wasn't just lifeless water. The Sumerians believed this ocean was made of two colossal living entities bound together in the cosmic dark. The first was Apsu, the personification of pure, fresh water, silent and incredibly still. The second was Tiamat, his polar opposite. She was the wild saltwater ocean, a turbulent and unpredictable force of nature. To the ancients, the merging of fresh river water and salty seawater was the ultimate act of creation. Modern researchers see this myth as a profound metaphor, perhaps even a primitive description of our solar system forming from a cloud of gas and dust. Apsu and Tiamat existed in perfect stillness for an eternity. There was no time, no space, only primordial chaos and a deafening absolute silence. Yet nothing in the universe is meant to remain unchanged forever, not even the absolute stillness of the cosmos. Within the vast mingling of fresh and salt waters, a new kind of life began to stir. From the union of the serene Apsu and the turbulent Tiamat, the first generations of young gods were born. Sumerian texts describe this emergence with extraordinary poetry. First came Lahmu and Lahamu, whose names are often translated as silt or muddy water. This is deeply symbolic. It is from the silt carried by rivers into the sea that solid land is eventually formed. They were followed by even more powerful deities, Anshar, who personified the boundless arc of the heavens, and Kishar, representing the horizon and the solid earth. Cycle after cycle, generation after generation, the divine family continued to grow. Then came the great god Anu, lord of the skies, and his son Ea, also known as Enki, the formidable god of wisdom and fresh waters. The universe began to pulse with movement and energy and, much to the dismay of the primordial beings, a deafening noise. This allows us to debunk a popular myth. Many imagine the lives of the ancient gods as perfectly harmonious. But the texts paint a very different picture. The younger gods were incredibly boisterous, restless, and chaotic. They played and moved incessantly, creating an unbearable roar in what was once a silent void. The relentless, deafening noise had become a global catastrophe. You have to remember, the primordial god Apsu was accustomed to the absolute perfect silence that had lasted for an eternity. But then came the clamor of his many descendants, children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, and it began to drive him to the edge. He could no longer find peace within his watery depths. Eventually, Apsu went to his consort, Tiamat, to complain about the younger generation's intolerable behavior. He told her plainly, their conduct was loathsome. He couldn't sleep by day, and he found no rest at night. It was then that Apsu proposed a radical, ruthless, and uncompromising solution. He decided to wipe out his own bloodline to restore the primordial silence and peace of the cosmos once and for all. It's a fascinating glimpse into how ancient myths infused all-powerful deities with raw human emotions, irritation, exhaustion, rage, and pure selfishness. When Tiamat heard this horrific plan, she flew into an unimaginable rage. Like any mother, even one who personified primordial chaos, she refused to see her children die. She lashed out at Apsu, defending the young gods and arguing that they could not destroy the very life they had created. But Apsu's mind was made up. Alongside his loyal advisor Mumu, he began to secretly plot the total annihilation of the younger generation. But the younger gods were far from fools, and catching them off guard was no easy feat. Chief among them in cunning and foresight was Ea, also known as Enki. Gifted with a unique sense of intuition, he understood the deepest secrets of the cosmos. It didn't take long for Ea to uncover the sinister plot hatched by his forefather, Apsu. Realizing there was no time for debate or negotiation, he decided to strike first. Ea chose not to face such a powerful primordial entity in open, bloody combat. Instead, he relied on ancient sorcery and his own unparalleled wisdom. He fashioned a formidable incantation, a perfect spell of slumber. As he whispered the words over Apsu's waters, the ancient deity instantly fell into a deep, unnatural, and unbreakable trance. It was, in effect, the first preemptive magical strike in the history of the universe. While Apsu lay powerless in his sleep, Ea finished him, stripping him of his dominion over the world forever. He then seized Apsu's wicked advisor, Mumu, and bound him in heavy chains. This victory marked a pivotal turning point in Sumerian mythology. Ea claimed his defeated ancestors' symbols of power and built a magnificent, radiant palace directly atop Apsu's lifeless waters. And it was there, in a sanctuary built upon the ruins of the old world, that Ea fathered the greatest of all gods, the mighty Marduk. Upon learning of the treacherous murder of her husband Apsu, the primordial Tiamat was consumed by a hollow, bottomless grief. For a time, she remained paralyzed by shock, retreating into utter isolation. But the other elder gods, who also suffered from the clamor of the younger generation and resented the new order, began to goad her with bitter reproaches. They accused her of standing idly by while her consort was slain, branding her a coward for failing to protect him. The poison of their words, combined with the searing agony of her loss, slowly twisted Tiamat's sorrow into a blind, all-consuming fury. The turbulent salt waters rose in rebellion. Driven by a thirst for vengeance, Tiamat resolved to wipe out every last one of the younger gods. For this looming cosmic war, she raised an army the likes of which the universe had never seen. Ancient Sumerian tablets describe the birth of these horrors in vivid, terrifying detail. Tiamat brought forth 11 distinct kinds of monsters: massive horned serpents with lethal venom for blood, ferocious dragons, nightmarish scorpion men, storm demons, and relentless hounds. At the head of this legion of darkness, Tiamat placed the god Kingu. She took him as her new consort and ceremoniously fastened the Tablet of Destinies to his chest, a supreme artifact granting absolute dominion over all of existence. Word of Tiamat's advancing invincible army of monsters struck raw terror into the hearts of the younger gods. Even wise Ea, who had once so easily defeated Apsu, was forced to retreat in fear after witnessing her terrifying primal power. Great Anu, god of the heavens, was equally powerless against the all-consuming rage of the primordial ocean. Facing total annihilation, the gods gathered in council, paralyzed by despair and fearing for their immortal lives. It was then that Marduk, young, radiant, and utterly fearless, stepped onto the cosmic stage. He declared his readiness to face Tiamat and her legion, but his help came with a steep, uncompromising price. Marduk demanded that if he were to save them and crush the primordial chaos, the gods must recognize him as the supreme and sole ruler of the entire universe. From that moment on, his word was to be law, and his authority absolute and eternal. It was a political bargain on a cosmic scale, and with death looming over them, the gods had no other choice. At a grand feast, they solemnly proclaimed Marduk their king, presenting him with the scepter, the throne, and the ultimate weapons for the battle to come. The clash between young Marduk and the primordial Tiamat stands as the most epic and cataclysmic event in ancient mythology. This was no mere skirmish between two powerful beings. It was an epical struggle of order and structure against the raw, untamed forces of chaos. As Marduk, clad in radiant armor, drew near the raging Tiamat, he chose not to engage her in direct combat. Instead, he relied on divine cunning and his absolute mastery over the elements. Blinded by fury, Tiamat threw open her monstrous maw, intending to swallow the defiant young god whole. But Marduk was prepared. He unleashed a ferocious, howling hurricane, driving it straight into her gaping throat. The gale surged within her with such violent force that she could no longer close her jaws. Her massive form bloated from the storm raging inside, leaving her paralyzed and defenseless. At that decisive moment, Marduk drew his bow and loosed a fatal arrow. It tore through her swollen belly, piercing her vitals and striking deep into her heart. The embodiment of the primordial ocean was finally slain. Witnessing the fall of their invincible queen, her terrifying army of 11 monsters fled in panic. But there was no escape. Marduk easily ensnared them all within his vast celestial net. The battle was won, but a new question loomed before Marduk. What was to be done with Tiamat's massive, lifeless form, drifting in the cosmic void? He couldn't simply leave her to rot in the abyss. As the supreme architect of a new order, Marduk chose to forge something beautiful from the wreckage of chaos. This is where the Sumerian creation myth takes a turn for the macabre. Taking up his weapon, Marduk split Tiamat's body in two, much like a fisherman might prepare a catch for drying. From one half, he fashioned the vast dome of the heavens, bolting it into place to ensure the chaotic waters above would never flood the world without his command. From the other half, he shaped the firm ground beneath our feet, the very world we inhabit today. But his work was far from over. From Tiamat's sightless eyes, he caused the great rivers Tigris and Euphrates to flow, carving the path for what would eventually become the cradle of civilization. From her breasts, he raised the towering, insurmountable peaks of the mountains. It is a vivid illustration of how the ancients perceived a literal, physical link between the natural landscape and the bodies of the primordial gods. With his monumental task complete, Marduk set the stars ablaze in the sky and charted the phases of the moon. The world was new. Mighty rivers followed their appointed paths, and bright stars lit up the night sky. Yet, this beautifully crafted world was completely lifeless and required constant care. Someone had to physically maintain this divine order, tending the riverbeds, growing food for the high gods, and raising their grand, shimmering temples. It was at this moment that a vast group of deities, rarely mentioned today, stepped onto the stage of history, the Igigi. While the famous Anunnaki were the elite rulers and absolute kings, the Igigi were the true working class of the divine pantheon. These were the lesser gods, forced by the Anunnaki to perform the most grueling, back-breaking labor on the newly formed earth. Modern pop culture often suggests that the ancient gods lived in effortless luxury, as if their palaces and feasts appeared by magic. However, Sumerian cuneiform texts, specifically the Epic of Atrahasis, shatter this illusion. The ancient records state clearly and unequivocally, when the gods lived like men, they bore a heavy burden. The Igigi were forced to spend an eternity digging irrigation canals and toiling in the depths of the mines. The toil of the lesser gods, known as the Igigi, was backbreaking, relentless, and utterly thankless. They labored under the scorching rays of the primeval sun, choking on dust and grime as they hauled colossal mountains of rock. Meanwhile, the ruling Anunnaki lived in idle luxury within their celestial and earthly palaces, haughtily demanding constant offerings of the finest delicacies and strong wine. Imagine the sheer physical and mental exhaustion of beings forced into such grueling labor day after day without a single moment of rest. Ancient Sumerian clay tablets record, with mathematical precision, exactly how long these lesser gods endured this cruelty. The texts tell us they bore their crushing burden for precisely 40 periods of toil. When translated into our time, that equals a staggering 3,600 years. That is 36 centuries of relentless digging, hauling, and building monuments for an idle elite. Over this immense span of time, the Igigi excavated the massive waterways that would eventually bring life to all of Mesopotamia. But even divine patience has its limits. With each passing century, the resentment between the two classes of gods festered, rapidly approaching a violent boiling point. Then came the historic day when the crushing weight of toil finally pushed them past the breaking point. The Igigi, broken by millennia of forced labor, cast aside their tools and brought the entire planet to a standstill. They gathered in a massive throng to vent their bitterness. In what Sumerian texts describe as the very first organized labor strike in history, long before the dawn of mankind, the lesser gods cried out that their burden had become unbearable. This relentless work was draining their divine essence. The anger and resentment that had been festering for 3,600 years finally erupted. The younger gods had reached their limit. No longer would they break their backs for the arrogant and idle Anunnaki. Their plan was swift and decisive. They would march to Enlil, the supreme lord of the earth, and demand their freedom. But this was no peaceful protest. It was a fierce, aggressive rebellion fueled by primal rage. To prove their resolve and cut off any hope of retreat, the Igigi gathered their shovels, heavy picks, and baskets and cast them into the flames. They watched as the very symbols of their long centuries of bondage were reduced to ash. Illuminated by the ominous glow of a colossal bonfire where their tools lay smoldering, thousands of enraged Igigi marched through the pitch-black night toward the Ekur. The Ekur was no ordinary structure. It was a magnificent fortress-like temple, the private sanctuary of the supreme god Enlil within the holy city of Nippur. Enlil saw himself as an absolute, omnipotent sovereign, never imagining his subjects would dare such a massive act of defiance. As the rebelling gods reached the palace, they formed a dense, menacing circle around its towering walls. Their roars echoed through the night as they hammered against the massive gates, demanding an immediate audience with their ruler to deliver their ultimatum. Picture this haunting, surreal scene. In the dead of night, firelight flickers across the faces of immortal beings as thousands of junior gods lay siege to the radiant palace of their master. Pure terror and confusion gripped the inhabitants of the Ekur. The rigid, orderly world of the elite Anunnaki had finally fractured, and the crack was deep and deadly. High above, in his opulent chambers, Enlil was jolted awake by the deafening roar erupting from below. Peering out to see an endless sea of Igigi, armed with torches and clubs, the supreme lord of the earth was seized by raw panic. He screamed for his servants to bar every gate with the heaviest bolts. Order had vanished. The situation was spiraling out of control. Trapped within his besieged palace, Enlil knew his personal guard couldn't hold back the mob of furious immortals forever. In a panic, he dispatched urgent messengers to the higher powers, pleading for immediate intervention. He demanded that his father Anu, the supreme god, descend from the heavens to the Ekur, and that the wise Enki arrive at once from his domain in the deep. When the three rulers of the universe finally gathered in the palace's tense atmosphere, Enlil's first instinct was a show of force. He wanted to crush the rebellion, punish the ringleaders, and drive the defiant Igigi back into the mines and canals at the point of a sword. But Anu, the god of the heavens, took a more pragmatic view. Before acting, he wanted to understand the root of such a massive uprising. He sent his personal envoy Nusku to the gates to confront the strikers. The Igigi's response was loud and uncompromising. "Every one of us has declared war. This backbreaking labor is killing us. The quotas are too high, and the burden has become unbearable." They demanded a total and unconditional release from all physical labor on the planet. The situation had reached a bitter, unyielding political deadlock. The High Council of the Anunnaki found themselves facing a desperate, near-impossible impasse. On one hand, they knew the striking Igigi were right. Their daily toil was backbreaking, and to punish them for the simple desire to survive would be a grave injustice, even by the standards of the gods. Yet, the work of maintaining the world had to be done. If the great canals were left to clog, the rivers would burst their banks and swallow the cities. If no one tilled the earth or sowed the grain, even the most powerful gods would soon face the bite of hunger. The air in the council hall grew heavy with tension. Enlil paced restlessly from corner to corner, while Anu remained shrouded in a grim, brooding silence. It seemed as though there was no way out of the crisis. Any attempt at force would either ignite a catastrophic civil war among the gods or leave the earth to wither into a barren wasteland. It was at this breaking point that the brilliant and cunning Enki stepped forward, the same Enki who had once saved the younger gods from the wrath of Apsu. He rose before the assembly and proposed a radical solution, one that would rewrite the destiny of our planet forever. Enki declared, "Let us fashion a new creature, a primitive man, and lay the heavy yoke of the gods upon his shoulders." Enki's proposal was a stroke of genius, though chilling in its cold pragmatism. He didn't just suggest finding more laborers, he proposed the artificial engineering of an entirely new species, flesh and blood biorobots whose sole purpose was to serve the great gods. These creatures had to be intelligent enough to grasp complex instructions and handle tools, yet genetically hardwired for submission to ensure they would never revolt like the Igigi. The Council of the Gods greeted this plan with overwhelming relief and enthusiasm. They immediately summoned the great mother goddess Ninhursag, also known as Mami, and laid out the task. While she was an unmatched master of life-shaping, she warned that such a feat was beyond her alone. She required Enki's direct assistance and a very specific, mystical ingredient. Forget the classic myths of man being shaped from simple clay. The Sumerian blueprint for humanity was far more complex, high-tech, and sinister. Enki explained to the council that common soil would never suffice. To grant this new being a spark of true intellect and the stamina for grueling labor, earthly clay had to be fused with the very essence of divinity, and that required a blood sacrifice. The High Council of the Anunnaki reached a grim decree. One of their own must perish this day to breathe life into a new race of servants. Their choice fell upon a rebel god, one who, according to the ancient tablets, possessed a brilliant mind and stood as a primary architect of the Great Revolt. In the cryptic symbols of cuneiform, he is known as Waila, or Geshtu-A. In an instant, his fate was sealed. Within a somber, ritualistic gloom, the god was ruthlessly put to death. His divine blood, the very essence of reason and the spark of life, was painstakingly gathered into sacred vessels. It was then that the wise Enki and the mother goddess, Mami, began their unprecedented feat of creation. Enki purified a unique clay drawn from the Abzu, the primordial freshwater abyss. With calculated precision, Mami began to blend this ancient earth with the still warm blood of the sacrificed Wela. The Sumerian accounts detail this process with a chilling accuracy that mirrors the sterile work of modern geneticists. The goddess fashioned exactly 14 measures of this divine biomass. 7 she placed to the right and 7 to the left. This fusion of celestial blood and earthly flesh was designed to forge the perfect laborer, a being forever bound to the soil, yet imbued with a fragment of the divine spark to carry out the complex will of the gods. Once the clay was perfectly blended with divine blood, the mother goddess chanted sacred spells over the mixture. Breathing life into it, these embryos of a new species were then carefully placed into the wombs of 14 chosen midwife goddesses. For 9 long months, the gods waited in high-stakes anticipation. It is fascinating how this ancient Sumerian myth mirrors the actual biological development of a human fetus. Finally, the 10th month arrived. The wombs opened, and the very first members of this new race were born, 7 strong men and 7 healthy women. The Sumerian texts called them Lulu, a term that literally translates to savage, primitive worker, or simply human. It's important to understand that these first humans weren't created for great philosophical achievements, space exploration, or the pursuit of happiness. Their sole, hard-coded purpose was to serve their creators for all eternity. As soon as they were strong enough to stand, the gods wasted no time. Heavy picks and shovels were thrust into their hands, the very same tools the rebellious Igigi had so gleefully burned. Enki's plan worked perfectly, and humanity began its never-ending shift. With the experiment a success, the weary Igigi were finally delivered from ages of toil. A great sigh of relief swept through their ranks as their chains were broken at last. The high Anunnaki retreated to the splendor of their radiant palaces, settling in to await the first offerings of food from their new subservient labor force. A new age had dawned upon the earth, the era of mankind. At first, everything was perfect, surpassing even the gods' wildest dreams. These primitive workers, the Lulu, proved remarkably efficient, tireless, and strong. They carved out canals with incredible speed, raised temples higher than ever before, and harvested such abundance that the gods' vast granaries were always overflowing. Humanity had become the perfect instrument, a flawless tool in the hands of the divine. Yet, even the brilliant Enki had overlooked one critical detail. He had failed to account for a single biological truth. Unlike the immortal gods, who reproduced slowly over eons, humans were terrifyingly prolific. The first 7 pairs multiplied with staggering speed. Hundreds became thousands, and thousands soon became tens of thousands. The earth began to teem with them. They raised clamorous cities and spread across the land, their numbers swelling without end. And that was when history began to repeat itself, in the most ominous of ways. Think back to the dawn of time. Why did the primordial god Apsu seek to annihilate the first generation of young deities? The answer is simple. Their noise was relentless and utterly unbearable. Barely 1,200 years after the creation of man, history repeated itself. Ancient texts tell us the earth began to roar like a wild bull. The constant clamor and chaos of a rapidly multiplying humanity grew so deafening that it reached the highest heavens, echoing through the halls of the supreme rulers. Enlil, the lord of the earth, was once again robbed of his peace. Driven to the brink of madness, he found no rest by day and no sleep by night. Plagued by the never-ending roar of mankind, he began to loathe the very creatures who had once saved him from the rebellion of the Igigi. Summoning a great council of the gods, Enlil delivered a stark ultimatum. The noise had become intolerable, and this biological nuisance had to be dealt with. True to his nature, Enlil chose the most radical path. Without a second thought, he unleashed a devastating, incurable plague upon the world. The pestilence tore through overcrowded cities, claiming thousands in an agonizing wave of death. This was the first recorded instance in history where the gods deliberately turned against their own creation, intent on wiping them from the face of the earth. But Enlil's plan to cull the human population backfired. Enki, the compassionate god who felt a personal bond with the people he had created, intervened. He secretly taught them how to appease the god of pestilence, causing the plague to recede. Humanity survived, and before long they were flourishing once more, making even more noise than before. Seeing this, Enlil was livid. He decided to unleash a far more devastating weapon, the climate itself. He commanded the storm god to hold back the rains entirely, and a brutal, years-long drought gripped the planet. Rivers vanished, crops withered, and a catastrophic global famine took hold. Sumerian records describe this as an age of total despair, where starving people were driven to eat roots and even sell their own children for a crust of bread. It was a calculated act of genocide. Yet, against all odds, humanity survived. Defying a direct order once again, Enki secretly fed the people with fish from his subterranean springs. Enlil finally realized that half measures would never suffice. At a secret council of the gods, he forced every deity to take a solemn oath of silence. He then decreed the Great Flood, a global cataclysm intended to wipe every living soul from the face of the earth and erase the failed experiment of humanity forever. But Enki found a loophole. He whispered a warning through the reed walls of a hut belonging to his loyal priest Atrahasis, instructing him to build a massive ark. And so, the first era of man came to a close, giving way to the history we know today. These are the incredible, and at times unsettling, secrets locked within the ancient Sumerian tablets. As it turns out, our planet's history began long before the first human was shaped from clay and divine blood. We've journeyed back to a time when the universe was nothing but a vast ocean of chaos. Before the great Marduk fashioned the earth from the remains of the defeated monster, Tiamat. Perhaps most striking of all is the story of the Igigi, a forgotten race of gods whose exhaustion and eventual rebellion paved the way for our existence. We are the children of a great compromise created solely to lift the heavy burden from the shoulders of weary gods. This ancient chronicle challenges everything we thought we knew about mythology. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into the depths of antiquity. I hope this story has helped you unwind and given you something profound to reflect on. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Sumerian lore, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Your support truly helps us bring more of these captivating stories to life. Before you drift off to sleep, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe these myths hide the true history of a highly advanced ancient civilization, or are they simply the brilliant allegories of ancient priests? Good night, and I'll see you next time as we uncover more mysteries of the past.